she took a break on this book. So, Time Machine, of course, is classic science fiction. A very, very famous book. Probably don't need a whole lot of introduction to it, but there may be a lot of things you don't know about it. Like the fact that it was H.G. Wells' very first published novel, the fact that it was serialized in 2 different versions in magazines before it was published as a novel in 1894 and 1895. So it actually exists in 4 different versions, if I'm remembering correctly. The first one called The Chronic Argonauts, and then The Time Machine was published 3 different ways. So there's 3 different, slightly different versions of that novel, which is, it's interesting. I've caught up with all but one of the versions, and they're interesting to compare. There are differences.
I've actually only ever read like one version, I think, that was different from the standard one. That was done by, it was actually something I read back in, it was grade school actually, the Great Illustrated Classics.
Okay.
They added in an extra little adventure before the epilogue in it, so I guess the whole
there's
point.
another version. I never heard of that one.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, I later read the standard version of it by high school at that point.
So the basic synopsis of the story is a guy invents a time machine and he goes into the future.
An unnamed character.
Yeah.
It's like they only refer to him as the time traveler.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1960 movie, they heavily imply that this time traveler is H.G. Wells because they call him George, and the plaque on the machine says "Property of H. George Wells,"
which they also did in Time After Time, I believe 1978. Malcolm McDowell, that was a good one.
I think it was 79.
Okay.
79.
He's chasing Jack the Ripper into
it's like what
present day.
What's more of a perfect kind of Victorian-esque adventure story of H.G. Wells versus Jack the Ripper?
Mm-hmm.
It's perfect.
It is. That was an excellent movie. So there have been a lot of spin-offs of the Time Machine, people writing books that are sequels and movies that are kind of tied into it. But the original story is very interesting for the fact that at the time H.G. Wells was very deep into evolutionary theory, studying with T.H. Huxley.
And then, of course, that evolution is another theme that he explores later in his book, The Island of Dr. Moreau.
Mm-hmm.
Although that one is done in a much more kind of sociological way, where you're looking at mankind as a whole, whereas this one looks at mankind as a species. So this one's strictly rooted in biological rather than sociological.
Mm-hmm.
That's just my opinion.
Okay. So the time traveler goes off to the future and discovers this future where the classes have evolved in 2 different ways with horrific results. And after spending quite a bit of time there and then moving on, he goes to the extremely far distant future where the sun has grown to a red giant and the earth has cooled down, and then he comes back home. So, but there's a whole lot of interesting detail into that basic story that isn't immediately apparent until you start reading it. The Time Machine is often treated as just a kid's book, but it's a very deep book. A lot of philosophy in it, a lot of scientific philosophy, a lot of sociological philosophy.
It's also worth noting that this was actually one of the first bits of time travel fiction in which time travel is actually done through a scientific mechanical device. Mm-hmm. If you actually look at any other time travel fiction written before Time Machine, it's usually done by magic.
Yeah.
Especially if it was a science fiction book, it was usually still done by magic.
Yeah, or somebody falling off their horse or something and ending up in the past. And it's also interesting how it's the very first time somebody used the time travel device to think about where man is going to be very, very far into the future.
It also kind of emulates a little bit from one of H.G. Wells' kind of personal observations, because one of his observations about people was that we were basically no different than amoebas. So he has this idea that any kind of upstanding civilization is actually just like, as far as the greater view of the universe, is rather insignificant. And you have to remember, we're talking about the British Empire. They were the ones who were literally controlling the world at this point. So to actually ask the upper class British public to view the human race in that way would have been very radical thinking for the Victorian era. Like way more than we would give it credit for.
But what Wells was noticing with the coming of the industrial age is how there were two classes developing out of it. The more intellectual class that had all the money and controlled the industry, and the working class. And Wells' background was the working class. He came from a relatively poor family and worked as milliners, I believe.
I think so.
And he was expected to go to work in the milliner shop, and he got himself out of that and into school, where he got a better education, started writing and started making more money, and changed his destiny. But his philosophy in all things is informed by having been part of that poor working class, that where most of the people could never ever hope to get themselves out of it. And he looked at the situation in Victorian England, and he thought, what if this is the way society continues on? How is it going to be in 801, 702 AD? And what he came up with is horrifying. The idea that the working class would take their machines underground and become monsters, evolve into these monsters that can only live in the dark, and the upper class, the intellectual class, would become effeminate and incapable and nothing more than cattle for the working class, which raided them and ate them.
Actually, one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I first read the book, because I'm sorry to say I saw the 1960 movie before I actually read the book. 1960 movie, by the way, is awesome. Highly recommend that one.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
It's when he first meets the Eloi, that's the upper class people, the ones who become rather effeminate, is that in the book he actually goes into big detail about how unless you're actually talking to one of them, like close up from a far distance, you can't tell a man from a woman.
Yeah.
And it really says a lot about the kind of lifestyle that the Eloi, that's what they're called, the Eloi have, and what they go through. And they're practically easy, a little too easy of a lifestyle that they have. And that the only movie that really explored that, though, was the 1961, which kind of does that, but just not in a very potent way that the book does. And then in the '02 version, they don't even explore that theme,
No.
which I thought was a really big flaw on their part. But I thought it was an interesting observation, and I would think that his observations with the upper class Eloi would actually be in a little bit more detail because he spends more time there.
Yeah.
Like when he first encounters one of the Morlocks, at first he actually thinks that it's like a spider or something, and then he has to look a little bit closer and realizes there's actually a ladder there, and he doesn't even really know what it is he's looking at until he actually realizes that it's a humanoid almost. But at a glance, it probably will look like something just indescribable.
Right. So, while the movies, of course, had to be tamed because Wells was dealing with basically cannibalism, and I find it endlessly fascinating that someone coming from a working class background would see that as the ultimate evolution of the situation in Victorian England, that the working class would become dominant and would control and subject the upper class and turn them into food. I mean, that's just such a far out concept.
I don't know. The internet says eat the rich a lot.
So does Aerosmith.
It's true.
So this book gets very adult if you explore these concepts, and also when you think about it in the context of H.G. Wells' socialist leanings, where he was a socialist because he wanted to see the upper class at least be able to live a decent life and be more than just slaves, and that was his take on socialism. That's what he wanted to see come about in the world, and to have that dream but realize this horrible possibility from the whole situation, that I think that takes a lot of courage to face up to that idea and write about it.
Yeah, the whole thing with like whenever you talk about a particular era in which the story takes place in, like even though Time Machine takes place for the most part in the far distant future, it's actually about the 1890s in which the story takes place.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually the truth with all science fiction. Science fiction is meant to be a medium that reflects on the era in which it was made, not necessarily the era in which it takes place. Like another good time travel story, Back to the Future Part 2. Distant future, 2015. Even though it's about those scenes are about 2015, they're still about 1989 when the movie
Yeah.
was actually made.
Mm-hmm.
So, but also I feel like the deeper messages of the Time Machine tend to get a little bit overlooked because, well, actually, I would actually have to say because of certain certain stories like Back to the Future, which have actually kind of more or less humor, added that to the whole time travel aspect of it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, there's some modern science fiction stories that really kind of miss the mark, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't really necessarily see the satire or the importance of what a book like this actually has to say because we are not living in the era in which it was made.
Exactly.
So I actually think it's very, very important, especially when you read a book from a Victorian era, is that you have to know the kind of situation that all the people were in order to understand the satire that's there.
Mm-hmm.
It's the exact same thing with Orwell's 1984, another great book. It's like, it's actually about 1948.
Yes.
And we think we know what it's actually about, but we really don't because we don't know the kind of life situation that the people of England were going through in post-war Europe,
Mm-hmm.
which was a mess.
Mm-hmm.
See, if we were actually living there at that time, the satire would be obvious. It would probably be painfully obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would be the exact same thing with Time Machine if we were around when that was first published.
Yeah. Well, the same is true with fantasy. The works of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, they were making commentary about their age through these fantastic tales. And the unfortunate thing is that people don't take it seriously because it's fantasy or science fiction, it's kid stuff, and they don't see those contexts inside those stories.
Satires like that are actually much, much easier, in my opinion, to talk about real, true problems in the world, more so than actually, just telling the truth about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's another great satirical novel, Gulliver's Travels, which
Mm-hmm.
deals with a lot of those kind of common themes too.
Right, or Voltaire's Candide.
Yep.
And a more recent series in that vein that a lot of people, again, don't take seriously as satire is the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett.
I haven't read that.
I haven't either, actually. I've just read about it. And he was poking fun at our world by coming up with this entire alternate fantasy world and exploring that for, I don't know how many books before he died. So, any further thoughts about the Time Machine?
Well, when it comes to H.G. Wells, I would say Time Machine is probably the ideal novel to kind of lure you into his kind of way of thinking. It's the first H.G. Wells book that I actually read personally. It's what got me hooked.
Yeah.
I have since read 4 Wells novels, so I haven't read all of this stuff, but I read 4 of his more popular ones. And I feel like when comparing the other ones, incidentally, the other ones are The Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, and Island of Dr. Moreau.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like Time Machine was an easier way to segue into it because it's way more of an adventure story. And a satirical science fiction story with a lot of important things to say is a whole lot easier to draw an audience in with the promise of an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas War of the Worlds promises destruction and disaster and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And Invisible Man and Dr. Moreau have a hint of horror. And, horror in any kind of a medium always sells.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to kind of bring it in through that kind of medium. But I actually think that Time Machine it's a great one for anyone who's interested in H.G. Wells to start reading.
Oh yeah, definitely. That was my first science fiction book ever was The Time Machine. So that one ruined me for life.
Me too.
Okay, so I hope you'll run out and read The Time Machine or some other great classic, science fiction or otherwise, and leave comments. subscribe to